Hi, I'm Dr. David Purvis. I'm asking a question today, and it's not a question I have a complete answer for. It's something I'm working on, but I think my question has profound implications if you struggle with anxiety and depression. So here's the question. Can you be anxious and depressed at the same time? Now, the reason this is an important question is that most people who struggle with psychological problems look like they're anxious and depressed at the same time. The reason being is that if you give someone a questionnaire, an assessment questionnaire, for instance, and you ask them to complete it, it will say at the top, over the past week, over the past 2 weeks, how often have you struggled with these symptoms, or how much have these symptoms bothered you? And there'll be symptoms of anxiety and depression, and people will typically go anxious and depressed. But of course that's a snapshot, and it relies upon human memory to go, yeah, okay, I've had this. Right. But my question is, can you be anxious and depressed at the same time? See, I think possibly not. And the reason I think that is this. I think depression and anxiety rely on slightly different, well, they rely on different neural systems. So let's deal with depression first of all. Depression is a conserving disorder. You're withdrawing your interest, you're withdrawing your engagement, you're withdrawing your connection to the world, you're kind of perhaps sleeping more, perhaps eating more, you're lethargic, you're not pushing out, you're kind of contracting. So a lot of times we think of depression as a conserving, as a withdrawing disorder. Now I liken that to some degree with activation of what we might think of as the parasympathetic nervous system. Now obviously the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system are completely, really complex. So it's not all parasympathetic, but I'm going to put the emphasis towards parasympathetic for depression. Anxiety, however, is an activating problem, right? You're under threat, you're going to fight, you're going to survive, you're going to flee. So you're restless, you're agitated, you're hypervigilant, you're breathing fast, you're trembling, you're sweating, you're activated. So that's definitely sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So my first piece of evidence is that really anxiety and depression are using different neural systems. Of course there's overlap, and it's not just as cut and dried as that, but I think that they're using fundamentally slightly different neural systems, and therefore the mood state is different. Active, yeah, got to survive. Yeah, I can't be bothered. I don't feel like it. I feel like a failure. Okay, so that's fairly obvious. The second thing is this. When you actually ask people to diarize their day, to kind of note their mood throughout the day, day after day after day after day after day, it turns out that people's mood fluctuates quite a lot. And what's actually even more interesting is that anxiety often predicts depression. So if someone starts a day feeling anxious, by the evening or by the next day, they're likely to be depressed. And so you're going through from an activated state through to an unactivated state, let's say. But here's the interesting thing, right? Your state has changed over the course of 1 or 2 days. Now, I see people who would say, I've been depressed for 15 years. They just say, I've been depressed for 15 years. Well, the two pieces of information I've just sort of shared with you would suggest that's not the case at all. Okay, you've been depressed for 15 years. Are you depressed when you go on holiday? No, when I'm on holiday, I feel fine. All right, so you're not depressed for 15 years, but you've created a global kind of generalized memory of how you feel about things as a general principle. But you're not actually depressed for 15 years. Now, you may have had an abundance of mood states that are depressing or feel depressing for 15 years, and you can remember that. It's unlikely that you've been depressed for 15 years because it's likely that your mood state is transient. Now, here's the interesting thing, right? One thing causes another thing. So if anxiety typically causes depression, getting into an anxious state becomes a trigger for a depressed state. And of course, we've got numerous complementary systems in place, right? The simplest one is just the practice effect. If you've been practicing being anxious and then being depressed, You're just practicing being depressed and anxious. But also we have the cognitive system. It makes sense of the experience. You start off anxious. Often a good predictor of depression is generalized anxiety disorder. Yeah, but what if I get depressed? What if I don't feel better later on? What if I can't sleep? Right? You recognize these as worries, a big component of generalized anxiety disorder, which then predicts depression. We have the emotional system, which switches in line with what you're thinking and what your body's doing. But we also have your body, this great big kind of machine that moves in the world and has its own intelligence and does its own thing way below your level of awareness. So you do not know what it is doing. It simply it throws into your consciousness the kind of end result of its computations, if you like. But here's the interesting thing. If one thing leads to another thing, if anxiety leads to depression, if anxiety triggers depression, if we start to recognize that anxiety is a trigger for depression, we can do something to change or to alter that progression. Now, if you watch my videos, you'll know that I say problems exist and persist in the absence of an alternative. Problems exist. They carry on being problems because you don't have a useful alternative. The alternatives that most people use are avoidance, withdrawal, lack of communication, anger, irritability, violence, alcohol, drugs, right? These are not alternatives to depression and anxiety. These are simply maladaptive coping strategies that work really badly and make the whole thing worse. Problems exist and persist in the absence of an alternative. Suppose if you would recognize that you can have this process of anxiety and then depression, suppose you used an active self-help tool in the point at which you're anxious. That might well then cut your descent in depression. And actually that might give you control over anxiety and depression. So we think of anxiety and depression as long-standing states. I've been anxious, I've been depressed for 15 years. Unlikely to be the case. You've had multiple experiences of being anxious and depressed for 15 years, and therefore your memory has generalized it to, yeah, I'm anxious and depressed all the time. Yeah, but you're certainly practicing that then. You're not challenging that path, and therefore you have no alternative that brings you out of it. So the mistake that the hundreds of millions of people are making is that they're not recognizing that they can pull themselves out of this repetitive process of creating anxiety and depression by using an alternative which is useful and meaningful. Now, it needs to be meaningful for the individual, and everyone's a bit different. But to accept transient states like anxiety and depression as being permanent and fixed states is a mistake. And I haven't done this research myself, but there's tons of research to suggest that mood changes throughout the day. And so therefore, if we take control over that change, we can have better times, or progressively better times, and less worse times. And if we have continuing progressively better times, next thing you know, it's all good times. So taking control of our transient state and turning it into something that we want, as opposed to something that we don't want, is the secret of active self-help. It's the secret of actively helping yourself to change anxiety and depression. Now, this is my hypothesis. I'm not doing any data collection on this. This is a kind of a theoretical hypothesis. But please leave comments and let me know what you think. Now, here's a couple of points. If you're going to comment, recognize that your memory for your experience is pretty poor. Your memory for your experience is very general, it's overgeneralized, and it will be colored by what you already think it is. So if someone says, I've been depressed for 15 years, I agree. Fair enough. You believe you've been depressed for 15 years. I'm just suggesting that's what the settled story is. But I think it's unlikely to be actually the story. Because even within a day, mood fluctuates and changes. The second thing is that if you've been practicing being depressed and anxious for a long time, you have created the sort of the neural architecture of being depressed and anxious. So what that means is that it's easier for depressing and threatening information to come into your system than it is for non-threatening and non-information. It's just a slightly bit easier, and therefore it's easier for you to fall into the trap to think that you're helpless and there's nothing you can do, because that's what it is. Okay, so just pay attention, be aware of these things. And I guess the final point is this: if we can start to become aware of the triggers, let's say for anxiety, then we can stop the anxiety in its place. But it's the awareness of the triggers that's going to get us the first step forward. Okay, when we have awareness, and then we have a tool we can use. So we've got to start treating ourselves in a way as a bit like, as I always say, treat yourself, you're a detective and you are the mystery. And we want to figure out what's going on so we can find the culprit and get rid of it, and then not have to be bothered with this mystery anymore because we're feeling like we're in control. Well, I hope that's all interesting to you. I'm finding it quite an interesting kind of story to think about right now. Please leave comments, subscribe to my channel, and if you want to get on the path to using active self-help, both as a research tool so that you can figure out what's going on in your life, or actually to eradicate anxiety and depression from your life, then please join the Anxiety Wizard program, which is my current self-help CBT program, and that will get you started. And it also gets you a little bit of access to me and also the community that we're building to be able to eradicate anxiety and depression generally. So thanks for taking the time to watch and listen.